Cecilia Muñoz, what a huge pleasure and privilege it is to have you. I think of you as someone who is sort of the consummate bridge builder, someone who has spent a career in the most civil of ways, trying to build rational arguments, trying to understand what serves people's highest and best interests, who is really good at bringing people together in a way that sort of is aimed at problem solving rather than at creating different kinds of complexities or discords, obviously. And yet, here we are in this moment. What does it do to a soul like yours to have that kind of style hit the wall of a contemporary America?
Oh, you're asking the question at just the right time. It's a hard question to answer with real honesty because this is such a frustrating time. And you were commenting on being in our nation's capital and looking at all the monuments and looking at the Capitol at this time of great discord. And it's hard not to feel that it's broken, because I actually believe it is broken. But I have to temper that with the deep understanding that we live in a democracy. Mm-hmm. We own this thing, and it is ours to fix, and I have to believe in our capacity to fix it. I think because I have to get up in the morning. And because I see every day the ingenuity and the grace and the connectedness with which Americans actually every day go about their business. That is real. It's present and visible every day. It's a little harder to see it because we're looking at it through the lens of social media, through the lens of even the mainstream media, through the lens of our politics, where that connectedness is not playing out very well. But I believe it's present. I believe that because I see it. And so I have not yet given up on our capacity to fix things.
So much of your career has sort of taken aim at the overarching issues that affect civil society from sort of a national perspective. Even before you came to the White House, it was really looking at the broad arc of national policy. Henry Cisneros said in one of the previous conversations that he felt that in some ways it was probably not possible, at least in the near term, to solve problems at the national level. He was almost that blunt, that to actually make progress, things had to be concrete, they had to be tied to a geography, a particular problem set, a particular political context, which sort of forces the conversations to ground. Does that at all comport with sort of all of your experience working nationally?
Yeah, it does. I mean, when you think about it, I think that's not new. I think many of the big innovations, certainly of recent history, are things which have been road tested locally. I was part of the effort to pass the Affordable Care Act, for example. I consider that a great victory, and that tens of millions of people got access to health care. Not that it has accomplished everything that it needs to. It was road tested in a state. And that's where the policy came from. The child health insurance program was road tested in a state. A lot of the conversation that's happening about policing, not that that can be fixed at the national level, but even the national level ideas in wrestling with this big problem, those are things which are being road tested locally. And a lot of our big challenges, a lot of the big instruments which are essential to our ability to function as a democracy, education, policing, those happen locally. They mostly don't happen nationally. And so I think it's possible that it has always been true that that's where our answers come from.
I assume from what you've said that you can kind of have both, that if you could create some kind of enabling architecture at the federal level that would permit that kind of innovation and that kind of ingenuity to move its way through the system, that's the ideal state. And I think there are many who believe with the ARPA money and the infrastructure money and some of the other initiatives coming out of Washington, that is exactly what this administration has tried to do. I don't mean to be political about it, but they're trying to create enough of a bandwidth so that localities can sort of move things up. And yet, one of the things that is becoming clear is that sometimes local politics can be every bit as complex as national politics. And that there are sort of concretized interests at the local level that are hard to budge, that there's sort of an approach of many mayors to sort of command and control the response to even complex changing situations. So as you hit the ground, how do you think about what the basic sort of building blocks of community capacity to sort of promote that kind of ingenuity might be?
I think it's essential that, frankly, policymakers at every level, whether it's the mayor or the folks at the federal level, or for that matter, philanthropists, right, who are looking for ways to kind of leverage these federal dollars and really make sure that they're impactful. One of the keys, I think, is making sure that the people who are ultimately the focus of this whole exercise, the people who will be affected by the policies, either as beneficiaries or as victims, both of those things are possible, that they're actually at the center of the equation. We've always had tools to make that possible, but we have better tools now, I think. We have more sophisticated tools now to make sure that community leaders, community organizations, community members are part of this conversation. And because right now we're in a moment where there is a real sense of urgency around focusing on equity, particularly racial equity, although equity in other dimensions as well, I really think it's an imperative that we insist that the folks making decisions, the folks driving flows of funds, do at least as much listening as they do talking, because we know that in previous iterations, other historical moments where we were building things, where we were moving things, where the federal government was acting, where local government was acting, we didn't always get it right? In fact, sometimes we got it desperately badly wrong, right? The highways that cut right through communities are a classic example, but they're not the only example. So we're in this moment where we can learn from that, both so that we don't repeat those tragedies, but more importantly, that we don't repeat the failure of listening, which contributes to those tragedies. So that means making sure the people who are affected have a voice. And I'm pretty convinced that if you can make that sophisticated enough to be a design conversation, not just like community input, but rather community design, that we'll get to way, way better, innovative outcomes.
Years ago, 30 years ago, in Minneapolis, we designed something in the mayor's office called the Neighborhood Revitalization Program. And it was an attempt to equip 81 neighborhoods in Minneapolis with the ability to plan and to articulate community priorities, and then to try to understand across 81 neighborhoods what could thread them together into sort of citywide systems. And at the end of the day, it became much less about the money, and it became much less even about the sort of the decision-making fabric in City Hall than it did with the ability of communities to organize themselves and to get very clear about what their priorities were, where they felt they needed help in executing against those priorities, and where they needed policy change in order to have that happen. And as I've watched the federal dollar flows of the last year or so hit ground, I think we're struggling with some of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to sort of create community machinery to try to affect policy orientation or prioritization of key things. It's another thing to actually move the money and to move the policy in channels that ultimately benefit the folks who ultimately are going to feel them the most. How do you do that?
Yeah, well, that's the question of the hour, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's highly skilled work is the thing. This is really what I learned even in the time when I was in the federal government, because we were trying so hard to make sure that the federal government was an active listener to the folks who were communicating locally. We tried to think of it as if you were the mayor, instead of having to navigate 18 different federal agencies, what if we in the federal government tried to do that navigating for you, so that we were actually across federal agencies listening to what a mayor and his or her local leaders, local communities were communicating about what their needs were. That's the same process, but the magic, at least is one of the things we learned in the Obama administration, was making sure that the folks with the technical expertise about how money flows were part of the equation, right? That we trained government officials who know kind of where the levers are to actually be. We had people in the mayor of Detroit's office. We actually had them detailed to work on the mayor's team because they knew how to navigate the federal piece, but we also trained them to be listeners, so that it wasn't them pronouncing this is what the federal government thinks you must do. It was them saying, all right, here I am. This is what I know how to do. Where is it needed? That's a very different kind of approach. And we went from situations where mayors were saying to us, yeah, I know what you're saying about technical assistance, but will you just write me the check, please? To, the mayor of Detroit, the mayor of Gary, Indiana saying, oh my gosh, thank you for the personnel and the expertise, because that allowed us to get to a different level. So taking that sort of one level deeper, that means really deeply making sure that the neighborhood association, the community association, again, the people who were the focus of this in the first place, also have access to that expertise. Because the one thing they are experts on that nobody else is what's going on their block, what's going on in their neighborhood, what their priorities need to be. But they don't always know how to access federal funds, and it can be, as you know, extremely complex to access federal funds. So the connecting their expertise about their communities to the kind of mechanics of moving money where it needs to go, measuring its impact, making sure that it's being distributed in a way that leads to equitable outcomes. That's a combination of skills. And this is why I think philanthropy is so important, because I believe with this administration, the federal government's going to just kind of do its best to make sure all of those elements are in place, but they don't have all the tools. Some of those tools are local, and philanthropy is in a position to unlock them.
Is that in some part what at New America you were trying to do with the nonprofit technology work that you began?
Yeah, I've learned so much about this. I started thinking that the idea was to have sort of tech solutions or tech-enabled approaches, and I've realized that's actually totally the wrong way to think about it. It's not technology itself isn't the answer to how you make all of this happen, but the skills of technologists turn out to be really, really helpful in making all of this happen, right? So you still have city officials, federal officials, community people, and you need to make all of that work. Technology may be helpful in making that work, but if you start with technology, you're almost destined to fail. If a government can deploy that skill set and say, all right, we are creating a program, let's call it a tax credit for small business owners, right? The policy can sound very good on paper, but if you can do the work to figure out how are those small business owners going to access the thing? How are they going to find out about it? What's the process going to be for them to access it? Where are they going to get stuck? How can you get them unstuck? The skills of technologists can help you deliver that more successfully, and that's what I came to New America to do, and which I've learned so much about in the time there.
So it sort of raises for me sort of this ongoing tension between sort of inside out, outside in, and where philanthropy or where civic society generally sort of chooses to sort of create and to put its roots down.
You and I could go on all day about this. I think place by place, the answer is different. That's why this is so challenging, right? And you have to design a solution that is suited to the civic architecture of the place, right? The United Ways, the community institutions which have expertise, which are trusted by the folks who are ultimately going to be providing childcare, or the members of the community who are ultimately going to be seeking information. You can come up with a beautiful, well-architected system, one that looks amazing on paper, that doesn't actually result in kids ending up, in childcare. And that happens way too often with policymaking. And I say that with all humility as a policymaker. Sometimes our educated guesses about what's going to be a beautiful structure are wrong. Mm-hmm. And the only way to test that is, do kids get served? Do all kids get served? And are we getting the kids who usually get missed? And if you can't answer those questions at all, then you haven't built a system that works. And if the answers to those questions aren't good answers, then your system isn't working. One
of the complexities that suggests for me is that the operating code of the different sectors might answer that question very differently. When you think about the public sector, it's get it done quickly, get it done efficiently, and get it done very visibly so that we can be sure that people understand that we did it. Mm-hmm. Completely legitimate, I understand that. The private sector has a different operating code. It needs to be at scale, and it needs to be economically efficient, and ultimately, if they're going to be asked to participate, they have to realize return. And philanthropy sort of sits back and tries to sort of see the big picture and put it all together and design the perfect system, right? Mm-hmm. One of the concerns I have in the current moment is that there is such a sense of urgency that it translates into heat that makes both the public and the philanthropic roles very difficult.
Yeah.
Philanthropy, we're waiting too long. Why can't you just move money immediately? Just spend down and be done. The public sector has its own sort of political problems. But when I look at the last couple of years, and as you mentioned earlier, the sort of the energies around racial equity and racial reconciliation, there is a sort of an intolerance for pragmatic, incremental, accretive kind of problem solving. And yet that's kind of what our systems are built to do. So how do we reconcile those things?
Again, I'm increasingly convinced that starting with a set of goals and metrics and capacity to measure them at the front end helps you calibrate whether or not, when you're moving quickly, whether or not you're moving so quickly that you're actually leaving some of those goals behind, or whether you're moving so slowly that you may never accomplish those goals. It's another way of kind of putting the people who are affected at the center of the exercise, which I think is everything. Because otherwise, and I've seen this happen, we build systems. The paid leave system in a bunch of states is an example of this, right? There are 7 or 8 states in the country that have paid leave on paper, which is a victory, except that I think in no state does even half of the eligible population access paid leave. That is not a policy victory. Earned income tax credit, right? One of the great anti-poverty policies, lifts millions of families out of poverty. A great success, except for the stubborn 20% of the eligible population, which never accesses the thing that they're eligible for. We've lived with that 20% margin for years and years and years. It's that we need to fix. If we're not thinking about those people who in theory should be able to access the thing, I don't think we get to celebrate the success of the thing. To me, that is very persuasive about why we have to have that evidence, that data in our minds, in our hands, in order to calibrate our work.
I was on a panel with a young firebrand of an organizer out of Chicago, and I gave a version of that answer when asked about, how does philanthropy work? And I tried to sort of say that there was a sort of a certain progression of metrics and measurements and adjustments and policy adjustments. Let me just say, she was not buying it. and she, to her enormous credit after the panel, wrote me a note saying, your heart is in the right place, but that is a previous generation's answer. She said, I can't wait. And when we spoke with Mayor Lumumba from Jackson in a previous episode, he said, you can only struggle for so long for your freedom before you forget what freedom looks like. And I think that's what she was saying to me. It is a little bit of a generational divide of folks who have been through enough of these complexities to know that incrementalism is probably the way we're going to get there. You can do some large, overarching policy moves that sort of accelerate that, and you can get an accelerated incrementalism, but it's still incrementalism. And I know we have felt that in all of the cities in which we worked. How do you embrace it? How do you help it along without being patronizing?
So the impatience of the folks I think of as organizers, especially young organizers, they're not wrong, right? Like, that's the thing. That the insistence on, like, we've waited way too long, generations too long, and enough already, is true. Like, I agree with that wholeheartedly. So then what do you do with that, right? They're right. It is all, but it's also true that building systems is not quick or easy, and building them well is even harder. But the incrementalism that you and I came up with was incrementalism that very often ended up serving some people and not others altogether, right? It wasn't incremental for the people left behind. It was nothing for the people left behind. So I think our work should be informed by that. And hopefully we can have the capacity to listen and learn so that the organizers' work can be also informed by what we've learned about how to build systems just by having been toiling at it for a long time. But like, if we had it all right, things would be different, right? So it requires some humility.
And would the Cecilia Muñoz of 20 or 30 years ago, the young organizer, have given me the same answer?
No, I probably would have set you on fire, the way my daughters do to me now. And thank goodness, right? There's some famous saying that I'm not going to get right, but that's kind of how the change happens, is that young people set us all on fire and insist, and together, hopefully, we all respond. We need a lot of that, but it's the fire, the passion, the commitment to getting it right, and the skills, the technical parts, which you know really well, like that. Those pieces actually really matter, but it matters that those of us who have learned those technical pieces don't get so experienced and wise that we forget to listen.
How do you think we have done in these last couple of years? I mean, you and I have both lived through periods of extraordinary turmoil, both locally and nationally, but the last couple of years do feel different. The level of awareness of issues of racial inequity, the changing vocabulary, the changing public discourse around it. And I get that, again, this is a bell curve, and at the extremes it's not so terribly different. But I think the middle has moved. Mm-hmm. Do you think it has moved? And if so, can it be sustained?
Yes, I think it has moved, and it has to be sustained and built on. I feel like we're living in one of those times when the fog is lifting a little bit on things which were always there and always true, but which we didn't all see as clearly as we needed to, right? The murder of George Floyd, I think, was one important moment, one of many important moments that frankly helped all of us see things which not all of us saw before, but which were real and true for a long time. And our systems are slowly, creakily beginning to change. I see it. I see it in philanthropy. I see it in the way governance happens. I was involved in the presidential transition in helping craft what ultimately the executive order that President Biden signed on racial equity, and the language of this thing and the intent of this thing and the way in which that team is implementing it is breathtaking and was not possible even in the Obama years, which is not that long ago. So to me, that's a sign that things have shifted. We are able to describe things. We have more language to use to explain it, and slowly better and better tools to address it. But I see that in the way within the foundation, the conversations we're having about how we do our work, who does the work, how we support each other in doing the work, in the ways in which our own team is diversifying, in the ways in which we are kind of building that understanding more and more deeply into every aspect of our work. As an organization, one thing you focus on in the quest for equity it has to do with personnel and hiring, but also the deep awareness of it in how we construct the work, how we carry it out, how we measure it, who's being reached, who's not being reached, how do we address that? I think we're all wrestling with those things, and they're very hard, but I think it's really encouraging that wrestling is going on in a deep way, and we're moving.
Is there a risk that in this movement of racial reconciliation and awareness that new populations are left behind?
Yes.
How so?
We are properly focusing on like what's in front of us, what is vivid. We are, I think, really, I as a human who has been in the civil rights movement my whole career, am deepening my understanding, for example, of the African American community. Mm-hmm. And as we all should be, and I don't expect to ever be done with that. I say that as a Latina. And, I also know that in my own community, we have an awful lot of work to do to help people understand us. In some of the work that I've done, we're starting to measure not just in terms of racial and ethnic identity, but also LGBTQ status, also with respect to disability. The Biden administration measures the extent to which it hires people who were first in their families to go to college, or the children of immigrants. which is a dimension that feels new, that is not something that gets typically measured, where we don't typically gather data. As our understanding grows, our ability to focus on one thing and leave something else behind also grows. But look, we have to move beyond the notion that we can only do one thing at a time, right? This is a very complex country. It's a complex planet. And, we can hold complexity. We can do that. But it requires the humility to know that there is never a point at which we don't have a whole lot to learn.
In all of this mix of complexity that you've described, philanthropy does seem to have this unusual ability to shapeshift, right? Sometimes it does take the long view and maybe an intergenerational view and helps sort of introduce some kind of mediating conversation that helps bridge between then and now and to come. Sometimes it's a risk taker in a way that very few sectors of society can be. Sometimes it uses just a whole suite of tools, convenings and research and grants. And other times it's trying to parse how different pockets of inequity can be sort of addressed and advanced. Do you think, because you've had such an interesting exposure to different kinds of philanthropy, that philanthropy is in fact sort of optimizing its ability to shapeshift and use its tools and move into spaces where it should be or shouldn't be?
So I definitely see it. And I have the privilege of being able to work with some of the most deft and nimble and thoughtful philanthropies. I put the Kresge Foundation at the very, very top of that list. I'm really honored to be a part of it because this stuff it's so complicated and the suite of tools is diverse. But the way I think of it is sort of the old way of doing things is to think of ourselves as operating in silos. We work on health, or we work on education, or we work on, and those silos are important. Those being expert in those areas is important. But one of the things I love the most is the complexity of having those verticals, but also having horizontals across them, right? So we also focus on cities, and what does that mean to the folks thinking about human services, and what does that mean to the folks thinking about health? We do social investments. Is that just about using money in these kinds of novel ways, or is it about using money in these kind of novel ways that also advances the work that we do in cities, that also advances the work that we're doing to kind of address what affects people's health? And the thing I have so enjoyed watching at the Kresge Foundation is watching these integrations happen, watching the work that sticks with its verticals, but also by having these horizontal pieces kind of expands and gets more complex. It's kind of harder to manage, and coordination and collaboration takes more time and more expertise. But ultimately, you can start to draw a line in the lives of a person in a city and the various ways in which our work touches that life with respect to access to services, with respect to the physical environment, with respect to arts and culture. And that's when you're really rolling, right? When you're addressing the dimensions of the humans in the places where we're working. And you're not just thinking in terms of issue areas. That's sophisticated work. It's really impactful work. It's also really hard to do. It's such a joy to watch it being done so well.
It is certainly true that there is sort of nothing more complex in urban affairs than doing integrative planning, and there's nothing even more complex than integrative implementation.
Yeah.
One of the ways of doing that kind of integration is landing in place. We are forced to, and it is in everybody's best interest to, work integratively in a place that we know well, where we can actually pick the systems. But as you were talking, there was sort of another piece of that, is that each of our disciplines sort of invites its own form of integration. That if you look at health, it clearly picks up the environment, it can pick up the arts, it can pick up human services. When you look at the human services focus on economic mobility, that's a community development issue, right? It's an educational issue, to be sure.
Sure.
Yeah. And so not only are you integrating and dropping into a place, but you're sort of in a place looking at the integration in in different ways within the organization. And that is a privilege I think philanthropy has. It's both unusual and difficult, and I think in fairness, I'm not sure we have figured it out, but I think it's the aspiration at Kresge to try to figure it out. And when you're equipped with the ability to use quite so many tools, you don't have to just do this through grant making. You can do it by convening and pulling people together and asking people how they would construct that kind of fabric, or circling way back to where we began. When you try to establish a suite of community priorities or a suite of community implementation channels, you've got to do that integratively. You just can't just sort of zero in on a vertical and hope that everything else sort of falls in place. You've got to sort of look around the corner, pull something else in.
Exactly. And we're in a moment where, having developed that set of tools in place, as it happens, we're really well positioned as a foundation to really kind of maximize this moment where there's a lot of federal dollars flowing to places, right? Yeah. So while you see people sort of, this is happening very fast, sort of struggling, running to catch up to make sure and to figure out how to make the most of this opportunity, by virtue of having developed all of these tools in place, this foundation's ready for that moment, right? To understand how the funds are flowing and to have built deep expertise over many years on how to make that happen in place in a way that actually moves the ball forward for the communities that we're most concerned about. So honing a set of tools has turned out to make us ready for this moment, but also, I think, position the foundation to be a huge resource to others who are figuring out also how to make the most of this moment. It's not just about grants and other investments and expertise and convening. All of those things hugely important and have huge impact, but then using all of those as levers when there are more resources, and in this case it's lots of resources, to make sure they land in the right place. There's a million ways to get this wrong. Mm-hmm. Getting it right takes deep expertise, and it feels like we're ready.
Cecilia, thank you so much for the time. It's just, it's such a privilege to think that we have you sort of at the helm, helping us see clearly on all these issues. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your service, as they say.
Thank you so much. As you know, I could do this all day. Thanks.